Hello and welcome. Today I'm going to walk you through the basics on OAC Semantic Model variables. It's very common for me to work with customers who are developing semantic models but are not utilizing the variables. These are very powerful, and when used, they can make security and the development of calculations much more streamlined and intelligent. Before we begin, if you're new to OAC and/or semantic models within OAC, it may be helpful to spend a few minutes and learn a bit more about the platform. We have a series of on-demand webinars covering most aspects of OAC, including a session dedicated to semantic modeling. I'll make sure to include a link to these videos when this gets posted. All right, so let's start by discussing some use cases where variables are most impactful. I'm on the September edition, 2025 edition of OAC. I'm obviously in Enterprise, that's where semantic models reside. And I built a little workbook to help illustrate today's lesson. Let that open up. Now, one of the main use cases of semantic model variables is for limiting data, also known as row-level security. This allows data models to restrict specific rows of data for any user and/or role. Next, variables can be utilized within a model when creating expressions or calculations. These variables can also be referenced directly on the front end within DV workbooks or classic analysis. And we'll talk more about that a little bit later in this lesson. At the bottom, I've added in even a few common variable examples. A great example is determining the current fiscal year. This means no more hard coding in a year and for a certain visualization or set of workbooks. If you have a data source containing common employee attributes like role, level, department, these can be used throughout the model to deliver a more personalized experience and, of course, tighter security. Perhaps you have a global operation and you want the system to determine the local currency, which is super helpful, so you don't need to build a canvas or a calc for each one. And these are just a few examples of why and where variables can and should be used. All right, so let's move on to variable types. Now, one thing I just want to mention here is these variable types in some documentation and blogs, they might be referred to as repository or repo variables, just in case you're kind of searching for additional information on them. I always like kind of letting people know that. All right, let's do a high-level overview of each of the different variable types, and then I'll demo and review each type in detail. We're going to start off with static. And as you can see here, not a lot we need to discuss. Static variables simply hold a fixed value. That's it. These can be numbers, text, dates, times, or timestamps. And they hold this value that doesn't change, and it's the same for all users. An example might be like minimum credit score or preferred credit score. Moving on to global variables. Now, global variables also has the same value for all users, but there are two main differences between static and global. First, global variables are initialized or set using SQL statements and not hard-coded values like static. Second, they have a refresh schedule, right? So basically you can set it to refresh perhaps every single day. There are a few other options available and some best practices that we'll kind of get into when we go do the deeper dive. And then session variables. A session variable's value is specific to a user's session and is usually set when a user logs into OAC. For example, you want to assign a user maybe their department or their sales region, or perhaps even their level. Now, again, they're called session variables because they only are initialized and kind of exist when a user logs into the system, where global and static are always available kind of running on the server. All right, now let's spend a bit of time with each variable type within the semantic modeler. So let's go ahead and navigate to my semantic modeler. And we're going to open up my one model. This is the one that currently resides in my OAC instance. And I've already created several example variables and deployed the model, so later we can see how to interact with them on the front end. All right, for those of you that are a little bit newer to the online semantic modeler, I'm not going to go through all the different aspects here, but this X indicates our variables. Now, first you'll see we have two folders, initialization blocks and variables. If we go to the plus sign, this gives us the option to create an initialization block. Now, you might be wondering why there isn't an option to create a variable too. Well, that's the first thing you need to know. All variables live within an initialization block. So this is always your first step. So let's go ahead and see what that looks like. Let's create an initialization block. And first we'll give it a name. So we're going to go in the same order that I just reviewed the variable types. So I'm going to call this example static. So you give it a name, you can give it a description, and then you select what type of variable you're looking to have. So we're going to select static, and we're going to say OK. So let's start with the general tab. All right, again, not a lot there. We got the name, the description. You can add some tags for later searching. Now, variables. When you create an initialization block, it comes with basically it's blank of variables. So we have this plus sign right here to add our very first static variable. So it creates a new record here. And to look at this in a slightly different view, you want to hit this detail view. And so first, this is where we're going to define our first static variable. I'm just going to call this V. I always like, everyone can have their own naming conventions. I always like to start off with V. So I'm going to say V static. I can give it a description, and then I can give it a value. Now, as I mentioned before, these can be numbers, text, dates, times, and timestamps. So for a number, I could just type in 12, right? That is a valid static variable. So this V static now is holding a value of 12. That's my number. And it's never going to change until I come in here, edit it, and redeploy it. So I'm going to go back in there. If you want a string expression, just put it in single quotes. Now that variable is going to be a string. And if you're looking for date times or timestamps, we have some constants over here, right? So for example, if you want to do a date, just click that constant function, and I can say 2025, 01, 12, and now I have a constant of that date. So again, reminder, this date's never going to change unless I come into this tool, specifically go into this variable, save it, and redeploy the entire semantic model. You can add multiple variables here, right? So we can have lots of different ones. So if they are logically similar, there's no reason not to put them on the same initialization block here. I'm just going to go ahead and delete that. And that pretty much covers, I'll just go ahead and save this. So that pretty much covers static variables. Again, they're very simple. They are powerful, but they're not very dynamic, and they do have a few use cases. But let's go into ones that I've already built. Let me give you some other examples. So that's an example static one I just created. I'm just actually going to delete that. And we're going to go into this other one. So this static initialization block, again, just got the name of static, but I have 4 different variables in here. And you can see their values and their descriptions. So these are just some different examples of why you might want a static variable. Really, the main thing is that this data is not going to change often. That would be my one kind of requirement to want to have a static value like this. Okay, let's move on to global variables. So we're going to create a new initialization block. We're going to call this example global. We got the type of global here, and we're going to say OK. Now, first, we want to go to the General tab and take a look at that. So we have the same name, description, and tags available. But you see here, we have a refresh schedule, right? So this variables or variable or variables that you set up in this initialization block can be refreshed on whatever schedule you require based on these frequencies. And I'll get into a little bit more of kind of how that happens and why you would want that. So let's move over to the variables tab. All right. Now, this is a little bit different because the way these variables are set is through a SQL statement, right? Unlike the static that you're hard coding, this is going to be coming from a connected data source. Now, the first thing you need to do is to set up a connection pool. Now, I'm not going to spend a lot of time going into this. This helps having a little bit deeper background on semantic models. But if you were to go to your physical layer and you go to one of your data sources that I'm going to open up, there's a concept called connection pools. That is essentially how all of the data gets connected to the data source, right? It really is your connection strings. Now, best practices say if you're going to create initialization blocks, you want to a specific data source, you want to create a separate connection pool specifically for your initialization blocks. So you can see here, I created a connection pool for all of my general reports and tables that are going to be fulfilling all of my different layers. But then I created one just for my initialization blocks. So if I come back here, again, what connection pool am I using? It's basically saying, what data source am I querying to get the data to populate my global variables? So there you can see my data source, and there's my init blocks connection pool. All right, now that we have that, we have the ability to just start querying. Now, the first thing you need to know about this is this SQL editor here, no matter what, is only going to return a single row. That is one of those things that I think is a little hard for people trying to use this for the first time on their own. So for example, in my workbook, I've built out these tables so you can see what they look like to help me kind of explain how the platform works. So what we want to be able to build is a variable that holds the current fiscal year, but we always need it to be based on the current day. So most people that have a data warehouse have a corporate calendar table. And this might include fiscal years, it might not. But for our purposes, we would want to mimic the ability to say, okay, what's today's date? It is 9/9. So we need a variable that understands today's date and is going to say, oh, look, my current calendar year is 2025, but my current fiscal year as of this moment is 2026. This is our goal, right? And of course, taking this longer, you might have fiscal month, fiscal week, fiscal quarter, all those other ones. So there might be many more use cases for this, but I just wanted to keep it simple for today. So this is our goal. This is really what we want to achieve. I'm just going to remove that filter for a second. Now, when I come back here, I am going to first put my SQL statement in for that table. So basically I have the date, day, my calendar year, my fiscal year, and this next part is obviously just my schema and my object name. So over here, once you've set the connection pool and put your SQL statement in there, you can test out the query. Now remember, it's only going to show a single row. All right, so it is literally pulling that first row from my database table. Now, 1/1/2025, 2025, 2025. We move back over here. All it's doing is pulling this first row, right? So you can see, okay, that's what it's pulling from. Now, what we want to do is like, well, I want that to limit it to just today's date. And one way you can do that is I'm saying, okay, where my day is, and I'm going to use sysdate, which is a database function that returns the current system date, and truncating it gets rid of the time, right? So I'm going to run this now. And if I've done it correctly, it is going to mimic this. Should be 9/9, 2025, and 2026. There we go. So we now know it's and understands the current date today. It's pulling it correctly. And now the next step, we have to assign variables to all of our columns in our row. Because remember, at the end of the day, you might have multiple columns in your data set or your table. It could have hundreds of columns. So you can have a variable for each column in there, but it's still at the end of the day going to pull one row. So you really need to isolate that in the SQL to only return one row every time. Now, the fun part, let's build some variables that will hold these values that we can then reference throughout the entire platform. So I'm just going to come down here, and now I'm finally going to actually create the variables. So remember, we're going to hit Detail View, and I'm going to call this VG just to identify it. That's my variable, and it's a global one. Like I said, these are just my naming conventions. And you have to add these variables in order of your columns. Now, for example, I don't really need date, day. I don't need to know the current day. I can always get that in all of my queries. So I don't need a variable that holds that. So I really only have two columns, which means I need two variables. So I'm going to say calendar year, and it is always best practice to put a default in there. And I'm just going to put a hard-coded default. I'm just going to say 2025, save. We're going to create one more variable. Actually, let's delete that. And let's see how that looks right now. I've created one variable. I have two columns. You can see there the first column, which is calendar year, is now being assigned to the variable, my VG underscore current year or CY. Let's go ahead and add another one. I'm going to call this one VG fiscal year. And again, best practices, put a default in there. Let's run and test this again. That's it. We've just created two global variables, right, that are holding the current year and the current fiscal year. So again, you want to take this further, you could have current year, prior year, prior year, all those could just be, you could have variables being able to create these values right on the server itself. Now let's move back to the General tab. This is where the schedule comes in. For our example, right, I would want this to run once a day. Maybe right after midnight or something. You could do it at like 12:01 a.m. So this will refresh that. It will rerun the SQL. And then, of course, if need be, it will update all of the variables you have in here. And that's kind of the purpose of a global variable that that has that schedule to allow it to refresh. Now, one other feature here I do want to mention today is dependencies, right? For a global variable, it can be dependent on another global variable. Because sometimes you need to have one variable or one value to use in the next stage of your calculations or whatever it is you're doing. You can almost think of it like a staging table, right? You create a global variable, and then you're going to use that value in a secondary global variable. So that's what does allow for dependencies, and a lot of these can get chained together if need be. So I am going to close that. I'm going to discard, and then I'm going to go into one of the examples I have. If I go back to my variables, go to my initialization block. So we're going to delete that global one that we just created. And now we're going to go into the ones that I already have there, and it should look almost identical, right? We're selecting two columns from my data. We're focused on just today's date. I'm setting my variable names, and I'm putting it on wanting to run every day at 6 a.m. And that is a global variable. Pretty straightforward. Now, moving on to session variables. These have the most options, and probably the most use cases too. So let's go ahead, create initialization block. Let's say example, we'll do session. All right, let's start at the General tab. Okay, first, pretty similar, but we don't have the refresh schedule because these only exist when a user logs into the system. So that means they don't need a refresh. So once they're set for the time being that the user is logged into that session. It does allow for deferred execution. I will explain that in a little bit. And now let's go over to variables. Now you're going to see the setup is similar, right? We're still going to populate the variables using SQL statements. So what do we do there? Of course, we need to select our connection pool or our pointer to our data source that has the data for the queries we're going to fire. Now, the one difference with this one is there are a couple different query return types, and we are going to start with variable values. I'm going to come back over to my workbook to help us explain this. And I'm giving you a full look at that table now. Okay, so this is my table that we're going to be using. right? It has my user, my OAC user ID. That's the most important thing. You need to have a table with the OAC user ID in there. Then we have some other basic attributes of the user. So you can think of it from a standpoint of HR, you might have dozens or 100 different fields or columns that you might want to have a variable because you can utilize it throughout the model and throughout all of your OAC development in the front end. So what do we really want to do here? When the user logs in, we want to isolate it to the current user, which would be here. And so basically we want to mimic that. And we want to hold four variables: a department variable, a status, a user level, and a product category, right? So we're going to create four variables based on the current user. And again, I already have this table available to me. Now, coming back here, from the query returns for the variable values, just like global variables, it is only going to return one row, no matter what you put in there. So let's go ahead and grab our initial SQL statement. So again, we're in this first one, I'm going to grab the user ID, user department. And when I say test query, oh, we just got lucky there, right? Because I happen to be the first row. Let me remove this. So in that table, I just happen to be the first row. That's the only reason my name came up there on this. But of course, that's not always going to be the case for all of our different users in there. So we need to make sure that this is filtered on only the current user. Now we do that by adding a where clause. Now let me explain this where clause. Of course, we want to do where user ID, right? We're keying on the user ID. But if you're not familiar with this, we are using a session, a system session variable. And I'm going to explain these a little bit more later. If you're unfamiliar with this, you can use this right here. This value of enqueue session.user will always pull the user ID who's logged into the system. Again, this has been used for row level security in this platform for years and years. Now, one other trick I do is I always make them upper or lower, just in case of case insensitivity, in case their cases are a little bit different from how the database is stored versus how OAC will present it. So you always want to do an upper or lower there when you're doing this. Now, when I run this again, it should be the exact same, right? But now we're guaranteed to only hit a record that obviously has where the user ID equals current user right here, right? So the first row returning is that. So now all we have to do, just like global variables, we just need to go in and give the variable names. Now, I don't need to know who the current user is because I already have a system session variable that I can call at any time to get that value. So I don't need to create my own. So we're going to get rid of user ID here because I don't really want to have that. And now we're going to create some variables. I'm just going to create four. I'll hit the detail view. And now we'll say D, and I'm going to use S just for these purposes for session. And I can say, remember, it has to be lined up to the column order. So department. All right. So that's one. And again, the best practice is to put some default values in here. You've already seen that, so I'm not going to show you how to do that again. I'm going to do VS. What's the second one? Status. VS level. And VS category. Now that we've added those, let's go ahead and test the query again. Perfect. That's exactly what we're looking to have there. So now, if we save and deploy this, that means we now have four other session variables that are initialized when any user logs into the system. These will be set. Now, in the cases where, for example, if someone logs in that wasn't put into this table, that's the reason why you put defaults in there, right? You just put some blank ones in there. The system otherwise will return a null, which could even mess up the queries even more. But just so you know why a best practice is to put defaults in there. This session variables also allow for dependencies. So you can see these are my other session variables. So it can say, oh, you want to run that one first because you might be using the values from it. That's how you do that. And then let's talk for a minute about deferred execution. Uh, so session variables are typically initialized and set when the user logs in. Now, I've seen customers that have a lot, hundreds of session variables, and that can take time for the system to load and populate and potentially run the SQL, depending on how the complex the SQL is. So, for session variables that maybe aren't as heavily used throughout the environment, you can say allow deferred. And what will happen is those will not get initialized right when the user logs in. It will wait until the platform needs to references that variable, and at that time, it will initialize it. So basically, it's a way of kind of offloading some of the variable initializations till later in the process until they're actually needed, if they're needed at all, right? If they are very important session variables, you don't want to defer them. You might as well just do them right up front. But that is a different strategy depending on the number and frequency of these being used. And the one other thing I want to, you might have seen this on the global sessions too. Specify query for additional databases. For sometimes sensitive information like this, like again, this is employee information. This might not be in your data warehouse, right? This might be in a different data source. This allows you to basically query another data source, not the initial one within your that we set up for our initial connection pool. So you can basically connect to other data sources just to load these variables and basically have them initialized, but they might not be the main data sources that you're using to provide all of your data for a lot of your reports and graphs and everything. And there are a few other options in here. And when I post this video, I am going to add a link to the documentation if you're interested in reading about some more of these, several of the other options available to you within this semantic model variables. Okay, so let's go ahead and close this. So remember, this was variable values. This is option one on session initialization blocks. Let's close that. And then I'm going to delete that. And I'm going to show you some examples of the ones I have already in here. See, we have the value only. Same ones we just saw, right? So no different than we just did. I just put a value of unknown. And then I kind of have my description and I have my neatly spelled and kind of uniform session variables right there. Okay, now let's do the second flavor of session variables. So this is an example. Session, names, and values. Once again, we are selecting session. We'll say OK. Everything's going to look the same. We need to select a connection pool. And now variable names and values. So the difference here is, let me go back to my kind of helper workbook. I'm going to hide that and show variable names and values. Actually, I'm going to show them both. So for here, we would typically have one record per user if we're going to be using this type of session variable, getting employee attributes, right? So we always need to limit it to one, so we always make sure we have the right user. Where on variable names and values, you can see here, every row has a variable value and a variable name. So this is definitely a table that you would need to create specifically for employing this type of method within the semantic modeler. So most people don't have tables architected in this manner. So what would our goal be here? Well, when I log in, we would want to make sure that my user has three different variables. That is the variable name, and that is the variable value. So you're basically already defining what your variable names are within this method, but it's also allowing more than one row, right? This method, one row, no matter what, no matter how you have it filtered, this can have, dozens and hundreds of rows per user. So let's go see that in practice. So again, I have variable names and values selected. And again, I'm going to all this is saying is like grab the first two columns, variable name and variable value, right? We're gonna see this data. Let me test query. There we go. And look, it shows everything, right? So we're getting more than that row, but now for every row in your table, we have a record, we have a variable name and a value. Well, obviously we want to limit it to just the current user, right? So we basically need to filter it again by the current username, and we're going to use the same where clause we did before. So let me go ahead and grab that. Let's run that query again. And now there are my three defined variable names and values. IT Active Architect. IT, or a little different order here, but obviously same values, same variable names. Now there still is one more step here. You still do need to define the variables down here, but they should match whatever they need to match, actually, whatever your variable names are here. So we know vdepth, vstatus, vrole. Oops. Vdepth, vstatus. Okay. Now the test query isn't going to look much different because they were already kind of named in the data set. But now at this point, they are objects within the semantic modeler that will automatically align with anything that comes through the SQL statement. Now, one other little wrinkle here is, let me remove this filter. If you notice, user 2 has 4. They also have a level, right? I don't have a level, they have a level. Now, the system can account for that where I might need to create one more. But even though I've created that fourth one, when I run this, see how it's still there is no, that user, or basically that SQL statement doesn't have a variable name of vLevel. So it doesn't exist for that user. So it can be, it doesn't always have to be even. You just want to make sure that you're doing it this one user. Maybe you have an additional attribute or variable that you want to assign to certain users. You just don't want to make it a common, within a common calculation. It might be really a one-off for a few specific users. Now, to mimic this, to kind of see what it looks like, let's say user 2 logs into the system. All right, so let's just kind of mimic, like if user 2 were to log in, what it would look like for them. So I'm just going to delete this function and hard code user 2. Now it should have 4 records with 4 variables. Let's go ahead and test query. So see, level is there now, right? So you can have basically all I'm trying to say is every user doesn't always have to have the same variables, but you just better make sure that level is not a commonly used variable because the other user didn't have it. So I'll just paste that the whole thing in there again. And there we go. There's our SQL statement. Test our query. And that is how we've created multiple session variables within this platform. So hopefully that gives you kind of like a good overview. Let me just clean this up. And I'm going to show you a few more examples. I'm going to delete that. And I'll show you my names and values. Again, exactly what you just saw. So no different. Got some nice descriptions in there. Now, one other example of a session variable, actually, before I do that, I did mention if I go into this one, you see that value of NQ session, right? That is a system session variable. Well, there's a couple of them with the system that you should be aware of. On this tab, I've shown you them right here. The function will be value of, and you can see NQ underscore session dot user. This will always get the current user. You maybe want the current browser language, right? There's a function for that. And this is another system session variable that you can call at any time. And did you know you can even get the roles, including custom application roles at any time? So I've seen a lot of customers use this and do a like. They might be like, oh, if this user's role is like maybe BI admin or DB content author, or maybe some custom application role where you can filter the users a little bit more based on this function. So this is just some powerful system session variables that you should be aware of here. Now, one good example of using this current language one is on my currency. I'm going to show you another way to use this. So I have a currency initialization block that is a session variable type. And look here, I'm just doing a select statement where I'm saying, get the web language, current browser language, and then determine which currency it should be, right? So I have my V currency in here, and whatever gets loaded, and I have a default of USD in here. Pretty simple, but just a different way of thinking about how to use these variables within the platform. And again, these are just session based. Let me close those. And just down here, these are all your initialization blocks. If you want to see all your variables, there you go. So again, it just takes the variables out of the initialization blocks just so you can see them. And of course, you can double click on any one of those and it will automatically open up the entire initialization block for it. All right, so that hopefully gives everyone a really good lesson on the different variable types and how to use them, right? Or and I shouldn't say how to use them, how to create them. Now we want to move on to the section of how to use them, right? So you've built all these variables, but where do you use them in the models? Where do they appear? Well, in the modeler itself, again, we could do row level security. We could use any of these in calculations, and I want to show you where they kind of appear here. So first, I'm going to go to my logical layer. And this is where, of course, having some background in the semantic model is going to be helpful for this portion. I'm going to come in here. I'm going to open my logical layer up. Let's say I want to put row level security on my products table. And let's say I'm loading a variable for my prod category by user, right? So I'm just going to open up my products table. And here, and this is just one of the ways to do row level security within here. There's several other ways. I can go to my data filter tab. And right here, you can see I've actually already set this up. But let me delete this and rebuild it from scratch. Let's say I have a custom or an application group, happens to be custom, and I want, for all those users in there, I want to assign this row level security. So I have a bunch of content managers, right? And they own certain product categories that they have access to within here. So I can select that role, select the expression editor, and right here, if you've ever built calculations or expressions in here, this should not be new to you. But if you're new to variables, you might have seen this X before and never seen it populated. There are all my variables, right? So this is the first place where you start to see them visible in the model where you can start using them. So I could say something as simple as product category equals category. I have now just added row level security to anyone that utilizes that is anyone that's in this role of content managers, and it's going to use the session variable of V category, right, to filter out only things that what they should have that product. That simple. I've seen customers create a custom application group for every single different row level security, like one for if you have 10 different types of product categories, they've created 10 different application roles, right? You don't need to do that. One application role is fine. And then you just make these variables and you make it very dynamic. And you just have one table that holds the user ID of their OAC user ID in their product category. And you can enable this in just a few minutes. All right. So another place where variables are most heavily used is when you're creating columns. So let's say, for example, I'm going to open up my customers table. And in my customers table, let's say I have a credit score, right? So we know the user's credit score, but what if I want to know their credit score eligibility? If you remember earlier, if I go to my variables and I look at one of my static ones, I have a min credit score. Let's just open that up. So we're basically looking for a min credit score of 650, right? So that is a static variable. I can use that in my calcs. So if I wanted to, and I want to come to my customer credit eligibility, I'm going to go to detailed view. I created a logical expression, and here it is. I'm going to open it up for you. I basically am saying case when customer credit score, and remember, that's just a column from my table, where customer credit score is in here somewhere. Can't find, oh, there you go. Customer credit score. I just dragged it over here, is greater than or equal to min credit score. And you don't even have to put in the function name. I'm going to delete that. I'm going to come back over here and I'm going to put min credit score. See how it puts that function name in there for you? It knows that you need that whole value to, and then I can say then, yes, customer is eligible. No, customer is not. And that's just another way of being able to utilize all of your variables in here to make it very dynamic. Right? One other area where you might see an expression editor is on joins. So let me close this and I'm going to go to, I'm going to discard this and let's go to our physical layer. We'll close some of these and let's just look at this products join. Again, you might have seen use join expression before. Once you click that, there you are. There's your variables again. If you need to use one of these potentially in a join, this is how you do it. Again, they're all being populated here automatically because we've created them. So they're going to populate this variable tab and they can be used in your expression join. So any expression within the semantic modeler, you can use these variables. So that was just a flavor of a few of the different use cases where you would use them in the model themselves after they've been created. Now, once you've done all of this and you've created your variables and you've created your calcs, you're going to want to deploy the model, right? Once you deploy the model successfully, I now want to show you that all of those variables can be referenced directly from the front end. So again, this model has already been deployed to my instance. And I'm going to come over here and I built a little reference guide for everyone. All right. So for static variables, we've already seen that formula or that function, I'm sorry, value of, and you literally just call the name of the static variable. And you can see here, those were my values before. And actually, let me go back to my variables. Let's go open up static. You can see min age 21, 650, 2025. See how they're pulling right through there? And all I did, these are just 4 different calcs. Each one, I have the value of, and I put in the name of the static variable, and now I can use these. And again, these are just standalone calcs calling the function, but of course I can use those in conjunction with any other data, any other aspects of my workbook. And of course, these are referenced the same way in Classic if you're still building with analysis and dashboards. For global variables, identical. You're just using the value of and then the name of the global variable. Now, session variables are a little bit different. You need to put the NQ underscore session in there, dot, then the name, right? That's the one difference, because if we went to system session, you would have seen that there, right? These are all the system session ones that you cannot alter or delete. They're just always there by the system. But when you create your own, you just have to put that NQ session in there, dot, and then it will reference the right session variable. And of course, then I can, oh, looks like I messed that one up right there, but it's all good. We all get it by this point. And that really covers all the main topics related to the OAC semantic model variables that I wanted to share with you today. As always, I hope this was a good use of your time, and thanks for watching.